Every economics textbook tells you the Great Depression spread because of bank failures and stock market crashes. That is the story. That is what they put in the curriculum, what professors repeat, what politicians cite when they want to sound informed about systemic risk. The bank failures were real. The stock market crash was real. But they were symptoms. The engine driving the global collapse deeper and longer than it ever needed to go was something else entirely. It was currency. Specifically, it was governments weaponizing their own money against each other in a coordinated spiral of competitive destruction that nobody stopped, nobody admitted to at the time, and that your government has repeated in every major economic crisis since. The 1930s currency war did not happen in smoke-filled rooms. It happened in treasury departments, in central bank boardrooms, in the language of exchange rate policy and gold reserve management. It happened in plain sight. And when it was over, the wreckage it left behind seeded the next conflict, which seeded the one after that, all the way to the policy decisions being made right now in 2025 that are restructuring your purchasing power, your country's trade relationships, and the global financial architecture you live inside without knowing it. Welcome to Noob Historian, where we pull back the curtain on histories, real players, and the systems they built to stay in control. This is not ancient history. The playbook written in the 1930s is the same playbook being run today. The players have changed, the currencies have changed, the mechanisms are identical. By the end of this video, you will recognize exactly what is happening when a government announces an interest rate decision, when a Treasury Department labels another country a currency manipulator, or when a finance minister stands at a press conference and talks about exchange rate stability. You will hear the 1930s underneath every word. To understand the currency wars, you first need to understand what every major economy on Earth agreed to chain itself to before the fighting started. The gold standard worked like this. Every currency in the system was fixed to gold at a specific rate. The British pound bought a set amount of gold. The French franc bought a set amount. The American dollar bought a set amount. If you held any of these currencies and wanted gold instead, you could walk into a bank and make that exchange at the official rate. Governments could not print unlimited money because every note in circulation theoretically had gold sitting behind it in a vault. In theory, this created stability. Exchange rates between countries were fixed because both currencies were fixed to gold. Trade was predictable. Capital moved freely. The system had worked reasonably well in the late 19th century, and policymakers in 1919 wanted to return to it after the chaos of World War I financing had forced countries off the standard temporarily. What they restored in the 1920s was not the pre-war gold standard. It was something far more fragile, dressed up in the same clothes. Barry Eichengreen's research in golden fetters draws on central bank archives across 14 countries to document the structural problem at the core of the restored system. The United States had accumulated massive gold reserves during and after World War I. Britain and France had emerged from the war with depleted reserves and enormous debt. The system was supposed to require surplus countries to allow gold inflows to inflate their economies, bringing prices up, making their exports more expensive, and rebalancing trade. Deficit countries were supposed to deflate, cutting prices, becoming competitive again, and attracting gold back. The United States refused to play its assigned role. American policymakers sterilized gold inflows, meaning they took the gold coming in and prevented it from expanding the money supply. They kept the gold and kept prices stable at the same time, which was precisely what the rules said they should not do. France did the same thing. Both countries sat on gold and watched the rest of the system strain under the weight of trying to maintain fixed exchange rates without enough reserves to support them. Britain's situation was particularly telling. When Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned Britain to the gold standard in 1925, he did so at the pre-war parity of $4.86 per pound. The problem was that British prices and wages had risen substantially during the war. At the restored pre-war rate, British exports were immediately overpriced in global markets. British industry became uncompetitive overnight. The deflation required to bring prices back down to where they needed to be at that exchange rate would crush wages and production. John Maynard Keynes publicly called Churchill's decision a disaster. He was right, and it took until 1931 for the full consequences to arrive. The gold standard was not a neutral technical mechanism. It was a cage, and the size of your cage depended entirely on how much gold your country held. The countries with the most gold, America and France primarily, had the most room to maneuver. Everyone else was squeezed. When the global depression began after 1929, the cage became a trap. Countries experiencing capital outflows, falling trade revenues, and banking crises needed to do what every government instinctively does in a crisis: expand the money supply, cut interest rates, and support demand. The gold standard made all of that impossible. To defend the gold peg, central banks had to raise interest rates to attract capital, even as their economies were collapsing. The rules of the system demanded that governments make the crisis worse. The critical insight from Eichengreen's research, the one that rewrites the conventional story completely, is this: the countries that abandoned the gold standard first recovered first. Britain left in September 1931. Its economy began stabilizing within months. The United States left in 1933 under Roosevelt. Recovery followed. The countries that clung to gold longest, the members of the gold bloc led by France, suffered longest. The gold standard was not the solution to the Depression. It was the transmission mechanism spreading it. And when countries started leaving it, they did not do so in an orderly, coordinated fashion with agreements and managed transitions. They did it unilaterally, competitively, each one trying to gain an advantage over the others. That is when the currency war began in earnest. When Britain abandoned gold in September 1931, the pound fell sharply against the currencies that remained on the standard. At the new lower exchange rate, British exports became cheaper in foreign markets. British goods were suddenly more competitive. The immediate effect for Britain was positive. For every country still on gold, the effect was the opposite. Their exports were now more expensive relative to British goods. Their trade balances deteriorated. Their industries faced a competitor that had effectively given itself a price cut without producing anything more efficiently or investing in anything new. Britain had not improved. Everyone else had been made relatively worse off. The academic term for this strategy is Beggar-Thy-Neighbor. The name captures the mechanism precisely. You improve your own position, not by generating genuine growth, but by transferring the costs of adjustment onto your trading partners. Your gain is their loss. The structure of the gold standard meant that when one country left and devalued, the pressure on the remaining countries intensified. They now faced even more competitive pressure and even less room to maneuver. The 2024 NBER working paper by Michener and von Schneider quantified what this spiral actually did to trade. Using newly assembled bilateral trade flow data covering the full scope of the 1930s currency war, they found that devaluations during this period reduced a country's trade by more than 21%. That figure deserves to sit in your mind for a moment. The strategy every country adopted to protect its trade position ended up destroying more than a fifth of global trade. Each individual government's decision was rational from its own perspective. The collective result was catastrophe. This is the central paradox of currency warfare. And it is the reason the playbook keeps getting used, even though it keeps failing at the system level. The country that moves first gains an advantage. The countries that follow are simply trying to recapture what they lost. By the time every major player has devalued, nobody has a net advantage, but everyone has contributed to a smaller, more fragmented, less functional global trading system. The game rewards the first mover and punishes the last, which means there's always an incentive to move and always a reason to retaliate. The 1930s spiral ran through several distinct phases. Britain's departure from gold in 1931 was the trigger. A wave of smaller economies followed Britain almost immediately, many of them tied to sterling through trade and financial relationships. The United States followed in 1933 when Roosevelt took the dollar off gold domestically, refused to cooperate at the World Economic Conference in London, and allowed the dollar to depreciate substantially. This move was enormously controversial internationally. Roosevelt was effectively telling the world that American domestic recovery took priority over international monetary stability. His Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, would later describe the decision in terms that make the strategic intent unmistakable. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland formed the gold bloc and held on, believing that monetary orthodoxy would eventually be rewarded. It was not. Their exports became increasingly uncompetitive. Their economies contracted while Britain and America stabilized. By 1936, France was forced off gold as well, the last major economy to abandon the standard. The sequence mattered enormously. Countries that left early got the benefit of devaluation when the exchange rate move was still meaningful relative to their trading partners. Countries that left late got the costs without the benefits. Their competitors had already adjusted, trade volumes had already collapsed, and the global system had already fragmented into currency blocks. The gold bloc countries' loyalty to gold bought them nothing except a longer depression. Alongside competitive devaluation, governments layered on tariffs. The United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, raising duties on more than 20,000 imported goods. Other countries retaliated with their own tariff walls. The combination of competitive devaluations and rising tariffs created the conditions for global trade collapse. World trade volumes fell by roughly 66% between 1929 and 1934. Supply chains that had developed over decades dissolved. Economies turned inward. International institutions were too weak and too divided to impose any coordination. What Eichengreen's research makes undeniable is that the gold standard did not cause the Great Depression. The Depression was triggered by other factors. But the gold standard prevented the normal mechanisms of recovery from functioning, forced governments into pro-cyclical deflation at precisely the wrong moment, and then transformed from a cage into a weapon when countries started leaving it competitively. The structure of the system turned a severe recession into a decade-long catastrophe. And when World War II ended, and the victorious power sat down to design a new international monetary system, they believed they had fixed the problem. They had not. They had redesigned the cage. In July 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The explicit goal was to design a post-war monetary system that would prevent the competitive devaluations and trade fragmentation of the 1930s from happening again. The architects of the system, primarily John Maynard Keynes representing Britain and Harry Dexter White representing the United States, understood exactly what had gone wrong in the interwar period. They had lived through it. They were building the replacement. The system they created was elegant in concept. Every currency would be fixed to the dollar at a set exchange rate. The dollar alone would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. Countries could adjust their exchange rates if they experienced a genuine balance of payments crisis, but only with approval from the newly created International Monetary Fund. The system preserved the stability of fixed exchange rates while giving governments a safety valve and, crucially, while making the United States, as the holder of most of the world's gold, the anchor of the entire architecture. For roughly 2 decades, it worked. Post-war reconstruction drove growth across Western Europe and Japan. American trade deficits pumped dollars into the global economy, giving other countries the reserves they needed to operate the system. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency cemented American financial dominance in a way that went far beyond military or political power. The structural problem at the heart of Bretton Woods was identified by Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin in 1960, more than a decade before the system collapsed. Triffin pointed out the following contradiction. For the rest of the world to hold dollars as reserves, the United States had to run persistent trade deficits, sending dollars abroad. But the more dollars accumulated outside the United States, the larger the gap between those outstanding dollar claims and the gold actually sitting in Fort Knox. At some point, foreign governments would hold more dollars than the United States had gold to back them. The promise that dollars could be converted to gold at $35 an ounce would become mathematically impossible to keep. The system contained its own destruction. By the late 1960s, Triffin's prediction had materialized. American spending on the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs had produced significant budget deficits. Dollars were flowing abroad in volume. European central banks, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, had begun converting their dollar reserves into gold, drawing down American gold stocks. De Gaulle explicitly and publicly called for the end of the dollar's privileged status, describing it as an exorbitant privilege that allowed the United States to run deficits and export inflation while other countries bore the consequences. He was not wrong. By August 1971, the situation had become untenable. American gold reserves had fallen to levels that made the $35 peg indefensible if foreign conversion demands continued. On Friday, August 13, 1971, Richard Nixon secretly gathered a small group of advisors at Camp David. The meeting was kept completely hidden from America's allies. No advance notice went to Europe, to Japan, to the IMF, to anyone whose economy depended on the system Nixon was about to dismantle. On Sunday, August 15th, Nixon went on national television and announced what became known as the Nixon shock. The United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The dollar-gold link, the cornerstone of Bretton Woods, was severed unilaterally. Nixon also imposed a 10% tariff surcharge on imports, a pressure tool to force other countries to agree to a new exchange rate arrangement favorable to the United States. The declassified National Security Council records and Treasury Department cables, documented through the U.S. State Department's Office of the Historian and subsequent NSF-funded research, show that Treasury Secretary John Connally was explicit about the strategy. In the negotiations that followed with European and Japanese counterparts, Connally reportedly told Allied finance ministers, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." That sentence is the 1930s playbook in 10 words. The United States used its structural position at the center of the global monetary system to impose the costs of its own adjustment onto every other economy on Earth. No vote, no negotiation, no coordination, a unilateral act of monetary statecraft that restructured every economy simultaneously. The dollar depreciated substantially after 1971. American exports became more competitive. The trade adjustment the United States needed happened. And the countries that held large dollar reserves, primarily Japan and the European nations, watched the value of those reserves decline in real terms. They had accumulated dollars as the system required. The system then changed in a way that reduced the value of what they held. The Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971 attempted to refix exchange rates at new levels, with the dollar devalued against gold and against other currencies. Nixon called it the greatest monetary agreement in the history of the world. It collapsed within 2 years. By 1973, major currencies were floating freely against each other, the fixed-rate system was finished, and the era of managed floating exchange rates had begun. In this new environment, the tools of currency warfare became simultaneously more subtle and more potent. By the early 1980s, the United States faced a new version of an old problem. The dollar had appreciated dramatically. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had raised interest rates to historic highs to break the inflation of the 1970s. Those high rates attracted enormous capital inflows into dollar-denominated assets. The dollar strengthened by roughly 50% in trade-weighted terms between 1980 and 1985. American manufacturers were being crushed by import competition from Japan and West Germany. The trade deficit was ballooning. American industry was lobbying Congress aggressively for protection. Congressional pressure for tariffs was building toward levels that threatened to trigger another Smoot-Hawley-style trade war. The Reagan administration faced a choice between accepting a damaging tariff spiral or finding another tool. They chose the currency. On September 22, 1985, finance ministers and central bank governors of the 5 largest economies, the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, gathered at the Plaza Hotel in New York. What they signed became known as the Plaza Accord. The communiqué was diplomatic in language, the substance was not. The 5 governments agreed to coordinate intervention in currency markets to depreciate the dollar. The target was primarily the Japanese yen and the German mark. American officials, led by Treasury Secretary James Baker, had decided that the dollar needed to fall substantially. Japan and West Germany were, through a combination of formal agreement and intense pressure, being asked to allow their currencies to rise sharply against the dollar. The documented analysis of the Plaza Accord and Jeffrey Frankel's Baker Institute working paper and the NBER working paper from 2015 traces what followed with precision. The yen appreciated from roughly $240 per dollar in September 1985 to approximately $150 per dollar by early 1987. That is a 40% appreciation in roughly 15 months. The speed and magnitude of the move were deliberate. Central bank intervention, coordinated across multiple countries, drove the adjustment far faster than market forces alone would have produced. For the United States, the Plaza Accord delivered the intended effect. Dollar depreciation made American exports more competitive and imports more expensive. The trade deficit narrowed over the following years. Congress's appetite for protectionist tariffs diminished. For Japan, the consequences were severe and long-lasting, and they were not accidental. A 40% appreciation of the yen in 15 months was an enormous shock to an export-driven economy. Japanese exporters, particularly in automobiles and electronics, saw their price competitiveness evaporate. The Bank of Japan responded by cutting interest rates aggressively to offset the contractionary impact of the strong yen on domestic demand. Those rate cuts flooded Japan with cheap money. And cheap money needed somewhere to go. It went into asset markets. Japanese real estate prices began an extraordinary ascent. The Nikkei stock index surged. Tokyo land prices reached levels so extraordinary that the land under the Imperial Palace was estimated by some calculations to be worth more than the entire state of California. The asset bubble that cheap money inflated in the late 1980s burst in 1990. The Nikkei fell from nearly 40,000 in December 1989 to under 15,000 within 2 years. Real estate prices collapsed. Japanese banks were left holding enormous quantities of non-performing loans backed by assets that had lost most of their value. The result was what economists now call Japan's lost decade, a period of stagnation, deflation, and financial paralysis that actually stretched across more than 2 decades. The causal chain is direct and documented. Plaza Accord forces yen appreciation. Bank of Japan cuts rates to compensate. Cheap money inflates asset bubble. Bubble bursts. Lost decade follows. The Plaza Accord did not cause all of Japan's subsequent structural problems. Japan's regulatory environment, corporate governance, and demographic trajectory all played roles. But the engineered currency shock of 1985 provided the trigger for the credit expansion that made the bubble possible. The Louvre Accord of 1987, signed when the dollar had fallen further than American allies wanted, attempted to stabilize exchange rates at the new lower levels. It worked partially and temporarily. The broader lesson the Plaza Accord demonstrated was that coordinated currency intervention at scale, backed by the largest economies acting together, could move exchange rates decisively and impose enormous adjustment costs on targeted economies. That lesson was not forgotten. What makes the Plaza Accord different from the 1930s currency wars is the coordination. In the 1930s, governments devalued unilaterally and without agreement. The Plaza Accord was a negotiated, coordinated intervention. But the underlying logic was identical. The United States used its structural leverage, its position as the dominant economy, its ability to threaten trade barriers, and its control of the key reserve currency to extract currency concessions from its trading partners. Japan and West Germany did not enthusiastically choose to allow their currencies to appreciate. They accepted an arrangement that imposed significant costs on their economies because the alternative, an American trade war, was judged worse. The 1930s beggar-thy-neighbor logic had been institutionalized into a formal accord. Dressed in diplomatic language and given a hotel name, it was still currency warfare. On September 27, 2010, Brazil's finance minister Guido Mantega stood at a press conference and said something that finance ministers almost never say. He named the thing that everyone in global economics knew was happening, but that the diplomatic architecture of international finance required participants to deny. "We are in the midst of an international currency war," Mantega said. The statement landed like a signal flare. Not because it was news to anyone who understood global monetary policy at that moment, but because a serving government official had broken the informal code that required currency warfare to be conducted through the polite language of monetary accommodation and exchange rate flexibility. Mantega was naming the mechanism directly. To understand why Mantega said it in September 2010, you need to understand what had happened to the global economy since 2008. The financial crisis that emerged from American mortgage markets in 2007 and 2008 produced the most severe global economic contraction since the 1930s. Central banks in the United States, Europe, and Japan responded by cutting interest rates to near zero. When that proved insufficient, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and later the European Central Bank began programs of quantitative easing, creating new money and using it to purchase financial assets. The mechanism through which quantitative easing affects exchange rates is straightforward. When a central bank expands its money supply substantially, the value of the currency tends to fall relative to currencies whose supply is not expanding at the same rate. Lower interest rates reduce the return available to foreign investors holding dollar-denominated assets, reducing demand for dollars. The dollar weakens. A weaker dollar was, for the Federal Reserve, a secondary effect rather than the primary goal. The primary goals were stimulating domestic credit conditions, preventing deflation, and supporting economic recovery. But from the perspective of Brazil, China, South Korea, and other emerging market economies, the sequence of events looked different. The world's largest economy was creating money at an unprecedented pace. That money was flowing into emerging markets, seeking higher returns, and the resulting capital inflows were pushing up the value of their currencies, making their exports less competitive. This was the 1930s dynamic in reverse. Instead of competing to devalue, major economies were flooding the system with liquidity that appreciated other countries' currencies without those countries choosing it. Brazil's real had strengthened significantly against the dollar since 2009. Brazilian manufacturers were being undercut by cheaper imports and priced out of export markets simultaneously. Mantega's currency war label was his government's formal protest against a policy being conducted in Washington that was imposing costs on Brazilian industry without any coordination or compensation. The G20 communiques from 2010 and 2011, the European Parliament briefing papers analyzing the period, and the IMF policy notes from those years all document the same tension. Countries agreed in formal language to avoid competitive devaluations and to let exchange rates be determined by market fundamentals. Countries simultaneously pursued domestic monetary policies that their trading partners experienced as competitive devaluations in practice. The IMF produced increasingly pointed analysis of the gap between the formal commitments countries were making and the policies they were actually running. The institution lacked the authority to enforce coordination. The 1944 architects of Bretton Woods had envisioned the IMF as a referee with real power. By 2010, it was a commentator. China's role in this period adds a layer of complexity that connects directly to the contemporary situation. Throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, China maintained a tightly managed exchange rate that most American economists and policymakers argued kept the yuan significantly undervalued, subsidizing Chinese exports and contributing to the United States trade deficit. In August 2019, when China allowed the yuan to depreciate past 7 to the dollar in the context of escalating U.S.-China trade tensions, the U.S. Treasury formally designated China a currency manipulator for the first time since 1994. The designation was reversed quietly in January 2020, immediately before the Phase 1 trade deal was signed. The designation's withdrawal was explicitly linked to Chinese commitments on trade. This sequence of manipulation and accusation, negotiated concession, and formal withdrawal of the accusation is the Plaza Accord logic in updated form. Currency manipulation accusations function not only as economic analysis, but as geopolitical leverage. The label is a tool deployed and withdrawn as bargaining conditions change. The post-2008 currency war battlefield extended into the European debt crisis as well. The European Central Bank's management of the euro through the Greek, Irish, Portuguese, and Spanish crises involved its own set of currency pressures. Countries inside the Eurozone had surrendered their ability to use exchange rate adjustment as a tool, which meant that all adjustment had to happen through internal deflation, cuts to wages, pensions, and public spending. The mechanism was different from the 1930s gold blocks experience, but the underlying logic was identical. Fixed exchange rates imposed the burden of adjustment on labor and domestic demand rather than allowing the currency to move. The 1930s had proven that this approach produced prolonged economic contraction. The Eurozone's experience in the early 2010s confirmed it again. By 2015, the IMF estimated that the cumulative global impact of post-2008 currency pressures had substantially reshaped trade flows, capital allocation, and economic development trajectories across dozens of countries. The institutions designed at Bretton Woods to prevent competitive monetary warfare had not prevented it. They had provided a forum for countries to discuss it politely while conducting it vigorously. The pattern across 80 years is not coincidental. It is structural. Every instance of currency warfare follows the same sequence of pressure, unilateral action, retaliation, and system-level damage, followed by an attempt at coordination that holds until the next crisis makes national interest override collective agreement. The wreckage of each conflict seeds the next one precisely because the underlying incentive structure never changes. Here's the sequence as it runs in every era. A major economy faces a growth problem, a trade deficit, rising unemployment in export industries, or the need to inflate away debt. It reaches for the currency tool. It devalues directly through abandoning a peg, as in 1931 and 1933, unilaterally through changing the rules, as in 1971, through engineered coordination, as in 1985, or indirectly through monetary expansion, as in 2010 to 2014. Trading partners face the sudden appearance of a competitive disadvantage they did not choose and did not agree to. They retaliate with their own devaluations, tariffs, or capital controls. Global trade volumes shrink. The economic benefit each individual country sought disappears into the collective damage. Eventually, the pain becomes severe enough that some form of coordination is attempted. A Smithsonian agreement, a Plaza Accord, a G20 communique, a Phase 1 trade deal. The coordination holds temporarily. The next crisis breaks it. As of 2025, you're watching the opening moves of what analysts at the Brookings Institution and PIMCO have explicitly described as a potential new currency war. The Trump administration's tariff escalations have reignited the question in precisely the terms Michener and Wanschneider identified in their 2024 research. When tariff wars prove insufficient or domestically painful, governments historically reach for currency weapons. The academic and policy debate about whether the Federal Reserve should or will cut rates in a way that weakens the dollar is not a technical monetary policy discussion. It is a discussion about whether the United States will deploy a currency weapon in conjunction with its tariff campaign. China's management of the yuan in this environment is being watched with the same intensity that American officials watched the Bank of France manage the franc in the early 1930s. The U.S. Treasury's currency manipulator designation framework, the apparatus put in place after the 2019 China designation, gives any future Treasury Secretary an immediate pressure tool that can be deployed or threatened without any congressional action or international agreement. The infrastructure of currency warfare has been institutionalized into the apparatus of American trade policy. The Brookings analysis from 2025 makes a point that connects directly to the 1930s evidence. Uncoordinated currency moves destroy the trade benefits they are designed to capture. PIMCO's 2025 research, revisiting the Plaza and Louvre Accords, reached the same conclusion Frankel's 2015 work had established. Coordinated currency agreements can work, but they require all major parties to accept costs they would prefer to avoid, and the political conditions that make such acceptance possible are rare and fragile. What you need to take away from this history is not a prediction about which currency will be weaponized next or which government will blink first in the current standoff. What you need is the pattern recognition that your government, your financial press, and your economics education almost certainly never gave you. When a central bank announces a major rate cut cycle while a trade war is escalating, you are watching currency warfare. When a Treasury Department labels a trading partner a manipulator in the middle of tariff negotiations, you are watching currency warfare used as leverage, exactly as Connolly used dollar depreciation as leverage in 1971. When emerging market currencies appreciate sharply while developed market central banks expand their money supplies, you are watching the post-2008 dynamic that Mantega described in 2010. The language used to describe these events in real time is always technical, always presented as responses to domestic conditions, always framed in terms of price stability, employment mandates, or financial system health. The technical language is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. Behind the technical language is a competitive dynamic that economists have documented rigorously across 8 decades, a dynamic in which nations use the price of their money as a weapon and call it monetary policy. The 21% trade destruction that Michener and Wanschneider documented for the 1930s did not happen because governments were stupid or malicious. It happened because the incentive structure of the international monetary system rewards the first mover and punishes collective restraint. Each individual decision was rational. The collective outcome was catastrophic. The incentive structure has not changed. The institutions are stronger than they were in 1933, but not strong enough to override national interest when the pressure builds high enough. They never have been. There's one final piece of the pattern that the history makes clear, and it is the piece that most directly connects to your life in 2025. Currency wars always transfer costs. They do not eliminate them. When the United States depreciated the dollar in 1971, American consumers eventually faced higher prices for imports. When Japan's currency was forced up after 1985, Japanese workers eventually faced a decade of stagnant wages. When Brazil's real appreciated after 2009, Brazilian manufacturers lost jobs. When the gold bloc countries held gold too long in the 1930s, their populations endured deeper and longer deflation than their neighbors. The costs of currency warfare are not distributed equally. They are distributed by structural position. Countries at the center of the monetary system, primarily the United States as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, have the most room to impose costs outward. Countries at the periphery absorb the most. Within countries, the distribution follows the same logic. Exporters and manufacturers bear the costs of currency appreciation. Importers and financial asset holders benefit. Workers in traded goods industries suffer first and longest. The 1930s currency war playbook is not a historical artifact. It is the operating system of the international monetary system. Every time a government says it does not manipulate its currency, check the exchange rate data. Every time a Treasury Department calls another country a manipulator, check what leverage it is trying to extract. Every time a central bank says its rate decisions are purely domestic, check what the trade balance looks like and who is running the deficit. The money trail has been there the entire time. Now you know where to look.